In March 2025, Russian police arrested the 51st richest man in the country. His name is Vadim Moshkovich. He built an agricultural empire called Rusagro, which became one of Russia's largest pork and sugar producers and controlled more than 3,000 square miles of farmland. That's a private company holding more ground than the state of Delaware. But by June 2026, none of that was his. The Interior Ministry announced that the property in the case had been transferred to state revenue. The total came to about $7.6 billion, the largest single confiscation of the war so far. Before that happened, people close to Moshkovich went to Russian President Vladimir Putin and asked him to intervene. He declined. This alone should tell you who is actually running the country. There is a war going on inside the Russian state, and it has casualties, prisoners, and even a balance sheet. But it isn't being fought with tanks. It's being fought by the security services, the economic elite, and the political managers. And instead of bombs and bullets, they're using prosecutors, wiretaps, court orders, and, in several cases, open windows. And only one side gets to control what's left. Hi everyone, and welcome back to The Domino Effect, the channel where we map the wars, the weapons, and the power struggles shaping our world, one falling domino at a time. I am your host, Kevin, and today we're going inside the quiet war between Russia's security service and Russia's billionaires to determine who is winning, what it has already cost, and why the losing side is not fighting back. This one has a lot of fun names in it, so giddy up. The first domino here is common to many of the issues surrounding Russia, whether it ends up first or last in the lineup. That's money, and it falls a long way from anything that looks like a coup. Russia's economy grew by roughly 1% in 2025. For a quick comparison, GDP growth in 2024 was roughly 4.1%. Rostat's report also estimates that GDP contracted by 0.2% year on year in the first quarter of 2026, the first annual decline in 3 years. And even that number is probably generous, because it hides what sits underneath it. The non-war portion of the economy, the part that makes things for Russians rather than for the front, actually contracted more than the military one. Yanis Kluga, who tracks the Russian economy at the German Institute for International and Security Affairs, noted that the first quarter of 2026 saw the non-resource sector falling into recession by 0.7%. Metallurgy was among the hardest hit industries with a 10% decline. Then there's the hole in the budget. The Moscow Times, the independent outlet the Prosecutor General's office has designated undesirable for exactly this sort of reporting, put the federal deficit for January 2026 at around $22 billion, driven by energy revenues falling by roughly half. That $22 billion deficit consumed nearly half of the country's planned deficit for the entire year in a single month. A normal state with a problem that size borrows. Russia can still borrow domestically, but it can't easily tap the deep pools of cheap foreign capital that it once could. A normal state might also raise taxes, and Russia has actually done that for this year 2026, increasing the VAT to 22%. But there's a limit to how hard you can squeeze a population you're simultaneously asking to volunteer for a war. So pretend you're the Kremlin. You need money at scale, and you need it soon, and every conventional door is shut. Where do you go? You go to the people who already have it. And in Russia, everyone who has it got it from you in the first place, which is domino 2. The state started eating its own elite, and it did it through the courts. Now, obviously, every country prosecutes rich criminals, and Russia has a deep bench of rich criminals. But stay with me, because the pattern is what gives this away. Between February 2022 and December 2025, Russian authorities transferred businesses worth an estimated 6.5 trillion rubles into state ownership. That's a little under $90 billion. That figure comes from Ukraine's Foreign Intelligence Service, and it covers a campaign of lawsuits filed largely by the Prosecutor General's office. In fact, the pace of nationalization has quickened, with 2025 seeing roughly 3 trillion rubles worth, or $35 billion, transferred, 4.5 times higher than in 2024. The names involved tell more than the total. Dmitry Kamenchik lost Moscow's Domodedovo airport, valued at about $4.4 billion. The seafood magnate Oleg Khan lost a crab empire worth roughly $4.3 billion. Alexei Kotin, formerly of Yugra Bank, lost more than $2.7 billion. And then there is Konstantin Strukov. Strukov ran a gold producer worth around $2 billion. The name of the gold producer is Yuzhur al-Zoloto. He was also for years a supporter of United Russia, Putin's own party. He was arrested and stripped of the company anyway. That's the best I could do on that name. Now let's go back to Moshkovich for a moment, because his case lays out the full sequence. He was detained in March 2025, held in pre-trial detention while the investigation ran its course, and charged with large-scale fraud, abuse of authority, money laundering, and intentional bankruptcy. Authorities also arrested his former chief executive. Then, in May 2026, a Moscow district court ordered Rusagro nationalized 1 month before the Interior Ministry announced the property had gone to the state. Arrest first, charges second, company third. And in some of the most prominent cases, that has been the sequence. And this goes back a long way. Alexei Borisov, the former head of a regional roads agency, had 19 plots of land, 15 houses, 26 apartments, and 40 commercial spaces confiscated from him. You could see the effect in the least dramatic document imaginable, the Forbes Russia Rich List. 8 billionaires came off of it in 2026. Only 4 of them dropped off because their businesses lost value. 3 lost their places because the state took their businesses, Kamenshtik, Strukov, and the food magnate Denis Shtengelov. The 8th was the Yandex founder Arkady Volozh, who came off because he renounced his Russian citizenship. A rich list has become a casualty report, and the casualties aren't only businessmen. In April 2024, Russia arrested Deputy Defense Minister Timur Ivanov, a decorated official sitting near the top of the wartime procurement machine. They jailed him and confiscated his property. Whatever else Russia's defense ministry is, it is not a soft target, and it was not spared. But confiscating a man's empire requires a case, and a case requires an investigator who can go anywhere and look at anything. Domino 3 is the instrument the Kremlin built to do that job, and the part nobody appears to have thought through is that it has no off switch. The Federal Security Service, the FSB, is the main institutional heir to the KGB. Over roughly the past 2 years, it's been given powers that are hard to overstate. Bloomberg reported in March 2026 that a run of legal changes gave the service wide-ranging access to corporate databases, telecommunications networks, financial communications, and even records of scientists' contact with foreigners. That list is worth sitting with for a second. Access to corporate databases means the service can see the ownership structure of any company in Russia without asking. Financial communications means it can watch the money move. Records of scientists' foreign contacts mean an academic conference becomes an intelligence file. None of it requires a suspicion of a crime first. In February 2026, Putin signed a law allowing the FSB to order any telecom operator to cut a named individual off from mobile and home internet service. The providers are shielded from liability for complying. No court appears in that sentence. British Ministry of Defense analysts assess that the amendments formalize and expand the state's ability to silence communications at scale. And in 2025, the FSB began rebuilding something it had lost in 2006, its own network of pre-trial detention centers. Not the prison services, its own. So after years of war, the only party in Russia that has profited is whichever has the loyalty of Russia's intelligence services. There is also the matter of the windows. The Moscow Times maintains a running list of Russian officials, executives, and public figures who have died in falls since the full-scale invasion began. It stands at 18 names. Some were ruled accidents, some were ruled suicides. I'm not implying that all 18 were murdered, but it's also hard to say that none of them were. What I can tell you is what 3 of those cases have in common. In December 2022, an IT executive in Nizhny Novgorod opened his door to police, signed their search warrant, let them in, walked to his balcony, and fell. In December 2024, a former Krasnoyarsk official fell from a 7th-floor window of an investigative committee building during an interrogation. Security footage reportedly shows him sitting on the sill beforehand. In February 2025, a musician who had publicly criticized the war fell from a 10-floor window while police searched his apartment. In each case, security services were physically in the building at the time. And Domino 4 is what happens when an agency with this kind of power stops being a tool and starts being a faction. For 2 decades, Putin governed by balancing 2 camps. On one side, you had the security hardliners. On the other, the technocrats who ran the economy. He arbitrated between them. That was the whole trick, and it worked. That balance was the load-bearing wall of the entire system. The hardliners wanted repression. The economic bloc wanted a functioning economy and kept pointing out that repression is expensive. Putin let them argue, took the middle, and stayed indispensable to both sides. Remove the balance, and you don't get a leaner, more decisive state. You get whichever faction is still standing, running the country on its own instincts. In August 2026, Bloomberg reported that Kremlin insiders no longer believe the balancing act is happening. Putin now sides consistently with the people who want tighter control over business and society, and the FSB is expanding with no visible limit on its power. Sources described one of its directorates as having effectively unlimited authority to investigate anyone at all. The other camp is losing altitude. Sergei Kiriyenko, Putin's domestic policy chief and for years one of the most powerful men in the building, has seen his influence decline after Russian political operations failed in Armenia, Moldova, and Hungary. Instead, the FSB has become the management company of the country, with ministries reduced to executing decisions made in the security service's interest. And the war keeps handing the hardliners ammunition. Levada Center polling found that only about half of Russians surveyed believed the invasion was going well, down 19 percentage points in 12 months. A bomb attack in central Moscow in early August 2026 gave the security camp fresh leverage to demand tighter control. Every month the war goes badly is a month their argument gets stronger. If you want a marker for how high this now reaches, in July 2026, Russian authorities brought a terrorism charge against Pavel Durov, the billionaire co-founder of Telegram. Hey, if you want the power struggles underneath the headlines mapped out rather than shouted at you, subscribe and hit the bell so you don't miss the next string of dominoes. Okay, so that's one side of this war. Now for the side with all the money and Domino 5, which is the one that surprised me. So you're a Russian billionaire in 2026. Your peers are being arrested. Your assets can be nationalized by a lawsuit you will lose. On paper, you have enormous resources. What do? It turns out you just pay. In March 2026, the billionaire Suleiman Kerimov, worth around $11 billion, volunteered 100 billion rubles or $1.4 billion to the state budget. That all happened in a closed-door meeting with Putin himself. Now notice that I put the term volunteered in quotes here. I mean, we all know what really went on. Just shortly after, the federal budget took in 220 billion rubles, or about $3 billion, in what officials described as gratuitous contributions from some of Russia's leading businessmen, who were conveniently unidentified. And notice what that tribute actually buys, which is close to nothing. It doesn't buy a rule, it doesn't buy a precedent, there's no schedule of payments and no receipt, because the arrangement's entire value to the Kremlin is that it stays discretionary. Pay this year, and you may be fine this year. That's the whole guarantee on offer, and Russia's wealthiest men are lining up for it, because the alternative is finding out what happens to the ones who don't. Then there's Andrei Melnichenko, one of the richest men in Russia, who broke a career-long silence in July 2026 with a profile and an op-ed in The Economist. Some Western coverage treated it as a moment of dissent. Read the actual text, and it's a loyalty oath. He describes thanking Putin for helping him see the light. That isn't a man breaking ranks. That's a man buying insurance in public. None of this is new, which is what ought to worry them most. In 2007, Oleg Deripaska told the Financial Times that if the state said he had to give up his company, he would, that he didn't separate himself from the state and had no other interests. That was a humiliating thing to say on the record, but it worked. The Kremlin bailed his business out through the 2009 crash, and he came out the other side intact. So, Melnichenko is running a play that has succeeded before. What's changed is the board it's being played on. In 2007, there was somewhere else to stand. Russia's billionaires had an exit, and that exit made the loyalty worth something, because it was chosen. Those exits are now closed. And look, the skeptics who say Russia's oligarchs are finished have a point about the confiscations, but they're missing what the aggregate shows. Russia's billionaire class is collectively richer than it was before the war, with wealth of about $697 billion in 2026, up from $663 in 2021. Sanctions pushed them out of the West, so they took over the Western businesses that left, and the domestic market got bigger. They're richer than ever, but they're also trapped. They can't internationalize, because the US Treasury now reaches into non-Western jurisdictions. They can't organize, because after 25 years of Putin's absolute demand that they stay out of politics, they were forced to cede political power to retain an economic one. And they can't want democracy, because in a Russian democracy, their fortunes would be treated as illegitimate, and any successor government would see them as exactly what they are, the men who financed the old regime. In short, Russia's billionaires are Putin's hostages, and they're going to share his regime's fate. This ties back to Moshkovich, the man whose friend asked Putin for help and got nothing. Every billionaire in Russia watched this happen. The lesson is to pay early, or watch the consequences, which might have you falling out of a window under suspicious circumstances. Which leaves the last domino, the one still standing. In May 2026, Western outlets reported that Putin's position inside the power structure had weakened badly, and that plans for his removal were taking shape among the ruling elite. Poland's Center for Eastern Studies, the OSW, went and tested that claim. They assessed that discontent among political and business elites was growing, and the trends running against the Kremlin are structural rather than temporary. But there was insufficient evidence that a crisis of power or an elite revolt was imminent. But I'd flag one thing about that finding, because it runs both ways. No revolt being imminent is not the same as the system being stable. What OSW described was erosion running the same way across every category at once: economic, financial, social, military, with no visible mechanism inside the elite for turning any of it into a change of course. That combination isn't reassuring. It simply describes a system that can only be changed from outside, or by breaking from within. There's no palace coup scheduled. The people who would have to organize one have no obvious mechanism, no organization, and honestly no incentive that survives contact with whatever comes after Putin. So what is the actual danger? Tatiana Stanovaya of the Carnegie Russia Eurasia Center describes the system as a mechanism under extreme pressure, where applying more force doesn't solve the problem, but can damage the wider structure. The risk isn't rebellion itself, but that Russia's running on a positive feedback loop, where the only hope of ending it is that it runs its course or something breaks it externally. Putin built the FSB into the instrument that keeps him in power. It now investigates whoever it chooses, jails them in its own facilities, cuts off their phones without a judge, and takes their companies through courts that do as they're told. It won a factional fight against the Kremlin's own political managers. And when the friends of Russia's 51st richest man asked the president to call it off in one single case, he said no. I don't know whether that was a decision or an admission, but I'm not sure he does either. So the variable I'd watch is this, and you can watch it with me. It's not the polls and not the front line. Watch for the first time this campaign targets a serving senior FSB officer. Businessmen were always fair game. The defense ministry turned out to be fair game too the day Timur Ivanov went to a cell. The FSB is the one institution in Russia that has only ever been on the collecting end of this. The day that line moves is the day the feedback loop has started eating the final pieces that help it run. That's when we'll know whether Putin created a shield or a successor. Thanks for watching. Subscribe if you haven't, and I'll see you when the next domino falls.